Hello everybody, welcome to Drydock episode 242. This week the questions are taken from guides 290 and 291 on the New Mexico class battleships of the US and the Le Fantasque class destroyers of the French Navy, along with the US 2022 tour video on USS Constitution, the U-534 video on her July restoration update, and the Wednesday video on Mulberry Harbours. Queen Luna asks, do you think the idea of the standard type battleship is a better idea than just making battleships with sometimes radically different designs? And on that note, do you have any easy ways for us to tell each American standard type battleship apart? I think it very much depends on the fleet in question. If you have enough to form a homogeneous battle squadron, division, whatever you want to call it, then as long as they're within shouting distance of each other, you're probably better off with iterative classes. So this is what you see with the Royal Navy after the initial weird budgetary constraints of the very early part of the Dreadnought race. Once you get to the Super Dreadnought, so the Orions, the King George V's, the Iron Dukes, etc., the Royal Navy is able to put at least 4 ships that are functionally identical into a battle division, at which point, if you have a battle division that's made up of the Orions and then you have a battle division made up of the Iron Dukes, or a squadron, because the division, you have 2 divisions making up 1 squadron, which is 8 ships total, which would have been really handy if they'd managed to do all the revenge calls, because then you could have had an entire 8-ship, 2-division battle scriquadron made up of exactly the same ships. I mean, the St. Vincent's and the Bellerophons and Dreadnought are arguably similar enough that you can make at least 1 division out of them. But anyway, when it comes to something like the US, which, because of budgetary constraints, is only really able to build usually 2 battleships a year to a specific design for most of the Dreadnought race period, then the standard class starts to make a lot more sense, because you can't have a homogeneous unit, and most people seem to settle on a 4-ship formation as your standard battle line unit. But if you've built 2 ships to 1 spec and 2 ships to completely different spec, you're never going to have a 4-ship formation that can actually operate together very easily. So then having multiple 2-ship classes, or in the New Mexico's 3, and being able to have each of those operate together as a whole is an advantage. Obviously, there are theoretically larger advantages to having your entire fleet with approximately the same performance characteristics. The only downside of that is that as time goes on and technology advances, then you can end up with a fleet that may be very rapidly outgunned. So I think if the First World War hadn't broken out, you might have seen a very different reaction in the US Navy, because the Nevadas are all well and good, the Pennsylvanias are all well and good, but given the relatively iterative steps you get until the Colorados, if Germany and the Royal Navy and the Britain had been still in competition, given that they were already at 15-inch gunships before World War I started, by the time you get to the Tennessees, for example, the competing overseas ships might have strode well away in terms of capability. So setting a standard set of performance characteristics basically lends itself to either a navy that's having to build lots of small classes one after the other, or a time when technology is relatively speaking plateaued. Now, as for telling the standard classes apart, obviously some of the visual indicators change quite radically over time. So if you look at USS West Virginia at the end of World War II and compare her to when she's around in, say, 1922, they're going to look like very, very different ships. However, relatively easy spotting guide starting from the Nevadas. Look at the guns. If it has a triple turret at the base of the super firing pair and a twin on top, that means it's a Nevada class. Similarly, going at the other end of the scale, if it has 4 twin turrets, it's a Colorado class. So that's your low-end and high-end standard class, which just leaves us with everything in between. So if the ship has 4 triple turrets, so it's either a Pennsylvania, New Mexico, or Tennessee class, then look at the bow. If the bow, again, we're talking about the earliest forms of them, but if the bow is roughly speaking, a straight stem, has a slight inward curve to it, then that is a Pennsylvania-class battleship. So that leaves us with the Tennessees and the New Mexicos. They both have Clipper-style bows, and they both have 12 guns, at which point you need to look along the hull. So if you're looking at the bow of the ship, or the bow sections of the side, that I should say, if you see a pair of what are obviously plated in casement mounts, i.e. cylindrical bulges, if you like, coming out of the upper part of the hull, then that's a New Mexico class. Whereas if the hull is flush, then it is a Tennessee class. I also turned it into this handy little chart, so you can use that if you like. Underway Studios asks, is it common for a country to keep ships in active continuous service for as much as 50 years? Are there any examples still afloat after 86 years from their keel being laid? Ships over 50 years old were definitely a lot more common back in the Age of Sail. In fact, whilst I wouldn't say they were more common than not, there were a lot. So if you went to a relatively large dockyard or naval base of some description in the Age of Sail, and you, for whatever reason, asked people, hey, how many of these ships are more than 50 years old? They'd find at least one or two. However, as time goes on, not only is the maintenance of iron and then steel ships somewhat more difficult, and also more complex because there's a lot more machinery, etc. internally, but the pace of technological advancement changes quite considerably. It accelerates, at which point frontline warships after 1860 are going to be so hopelessly obsolete in 50 years that they are not going to be kept in continuous active service. Now, there are a few minor exceptions to this, and when I say frontline warships, I'm talking about things like carriers, cruisers, battleships, destroyers, that kind of thing. Now, the exceptions to this are if a ship is moved off to a secondary role, then it might be kept in continuous service, but not as a frontline ship. So it might be an accommodation ship, it might be a training ship, it might be sold to another navy. That navy might then sell the ship on to yet another navy. You've also got ships that are very unique in their capabilities. So that's why the Brazilian River Monitor Parnaíba is gracing our screens at the moment. You know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Parnaíba works perfectly well with various weapons refits and capabilities added going up and down the Amazon, so she's still around well over 50 years after her keel was laid. Kamuna, we've covered in the past, the Russian salvage ship -- former submarine operating base. Again, you know, she's not a frontline warship, but she does a job, and it's basically cheaper to keep her running and in service than it is to build something brand new, and so she just keeps going in that. So in these cases, they're in their particular branches of naval activity, there haven't been the massive steps that have taken place with major surface combatants. Now, you could argue perhaps that with both Parnaíba and Kamuna, you could build something significantly more capable using modern technology, which I suppose would be true, but that's a big upfront cost for relatively minor increases in capability. Bill Brockman asks, what did they use the space left over from plated over hull casement guns for? It depends to what purpose and how extensive the casement plating in was going. So you can see here on USS Idaho some of the plated in from the start casements just there under the front turret and just in front of the front turret. And in these cases where it was a case of basically plating in the casements because otherwise they were unworkable in the sea, then usually they would just become passageways. Perhaps in peacetime you might end up with a little bit of the space they use for storage of small items in transit, but generally speaking, aboard warships you don't like to store loose items in the middle of passageways, so not a huge amount would change for them. But when you're looking at ships that perhaps have significantly more casements plated in, and or have gone through complete refit, so perhaps the casements are suppressed entirely, like, say, Queen Elizabeth, Valiant and Renown, then in those cases, the space where effectively a gun deck used to be will be converted into a number of separate purposes. Usually in those cases you have additional anti-aircraft guns installed up top, at which point you're probably going to have minimum ammunition feeds, possibly even barbettes coming through the space. And the remaining space might either form some kind of slightly weird elongating and then narrowing passageway, or alternatively the compartments further inboard may be expanded to take up some of that space. So it really does vary on a ship-by-ship basis, depending on exactly what degree of other modernisation is going on. Brendan Buersdorf asks, if the Germans had managed to navalize the 150mm Flak 50, would it have made an effective secondary-heavy anti-aircraft weapon? I know there's a lot of criticism of German mixed secondary layouts and figured this could be a solution. I mean, in theory, it does seem like a good idea. However, there are a few problems. The 150mm is obviously near enough as makes no difference, a 6-inch caliber weapon. It's in that zone, and as we know, everybody rather struggled to get a 6-inch dual-purpose gun into service. You know, you had a few that were beginning to show up right towards the end of World War II. Now, whilst the Flak 50 is a little bit earlier, and as you can see, it has this rather handy little box magazine on with it, which would make at least initial burst fire somewhat easier, it also would render the mount, whatever type of mount you put it in, rather vulnerable to taking hits. And with so much ammunition present, you would definitely need to have some kind of fully enclosed turret. And given the bulk of the thing, I mean, okay, it's not massively more bulky than your average 6-inch-ish gun, but it is a little bit more bulky. And so you would need to mount it in at least a twin turret, and that's going to be a fairly hefty one. I would have concerns about quite how you're supposed to reload the auto-loading feed system with 150mm shells in the middle of combat. So, yeah, as I said, it's a nice idea in principle, but in practice it probably would have been bulky, it probably would have broken down a fair bit, and it would have been an absolute pig to reload, especially reload safely. If the Germans were going to navalize anything that they could potentially then use as a solution to their issue of having split batteries, then I personally would rather go with the 128mm Flak 40, particularly because they did actually have land-based 128mm Flak 40 twin mounts, and the twin mount is only marginally heavier than this single 150mm, and obviously you have two barrels, and it has a greater, I think twice as many rounds per minute downrange, which, given you're talking the difference between 128 and 150mm shell, doubling the amount of shells going downrange is going to be a significant advantage over this thing. So that would be my personal pick if they're going to navalize anything. HMS Belfast asks, in World War II, the electricians branch of the Royal Navy was part of the torpedo branch. Why was this? Also, what roles did electricians fill on ships, as there isn't going to be an electrical fault all of the time? Well, it goes back all the way to the middle of the 19th century, believe it or not. So, electricity did gradually filter its way onto Royal Navy ships, but before that happened, electricity had another role at sea, and that was in the operation of command-detonated mines, which were invented pretty quickly after the initial deployment of mines in the Crimean War. Now, because the electrically detonated mine was initially known as the torpedo, and what we would now call the torpedo was the locomotive torpedo, hence in the American Civil War you have the saying, damn the torpedoes full speed ahead, when he's actually referring to mines. It meant that the very first people in the Royal Navy who really had to concern themselves with how electricity worked were people who were dealing with either the diffusing of enemy mines, the countering of enemy mines, or indeed manning your own mines, which was, as we just said, at the time referred to as torpedoes, and hence the torpedo school was the first to actually start teaching its officers and men how to deal with electrical circuitry. As time went on, then ships began to be powered by electrical lighting, and then they looked around and said, well, okay, well, now we have all these wonderful electrical systems on our ship, because you have electrical lighting, you have electrical firing, and all sorts of other fancy things coming in. So who in the Navy knows anything about electrics? Oh, right, there's this whole bunch of people over who are trained by the torpedo school who are already being taught about electrical systems. Well, we'll just expand that. And so the electricians branch basically stayed with the torpedo branch, because that's where it was when everybody realised they suddenly needed a lot of electricians beyond the niche role that they'd originally filled. Now, as far as what roles do electricians have on a ship as there isn't going to be a fault all the time, well, considering the hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of miles of cabling in ships once electricity really got moving, there's almost always going to be a fault somewhere to fix. And even when there isn't, part of the reason that there won't be shorts all the time is because of maintenance, and electricians therefore have a lot of maintenance to be working on. In some ways, electricians on ships are a bit like IT personnel in companies, in that, unfortunately, in a lot of commercial companies, you'll have a big IT disaster, and then everyone will go, oh, we shall hire a bunch of IT technicians to repair and restore everything and get everything back up to normal. And then everything is working fine. And then a few months or a few years later, some genius in upper management decides, our IT systems work fine all the time. We have this massive IT department, and we are always paying them lots of money. And why are we paying them money? Because they're never fixing anything. So let's get rid of them all. And shockingly enough, because now the IT guys aren't around to do maintenance, 6 months later everything falls over, or you get a ransomware virus attack and everything locks up again. And the cycle repeats, because upper management are dumb. Nonetheless, this is kind of the same situation with electricians aboard ships, in that if they're doing their jobs properly, you might not ever think that they need to do their jobs, because electrical things won't really tend to go wrong. Fortunately, however, because most of the time navies are sensible enough to realise things about maintenance, because they have a lot of stuff that needs maintenance, they don't tend to go in hire and fire cycles of their electricians, which is something of a relief, I'm sure, for everybody else who's on board. Plus, electricians, because of what they work on, can quite often help in a lot of other fine-tuning and calibration if necessary. Josh Thomas Moore asks, if urban combat is the nightmare for generals, what's an admiral's nightmare? Basically, close-range action, melee. Now, that might seem a little bit odd, considering several navies seem to be particularly eager to get into close range and start hammering away at people. But a full-on melee, whatever that happens to be in the Age of Sail, that's going to be, pistol shot range. In World War II, that's going to be a couple of thousand yards. That is the ultimate admiral's nightmare, because essentially to engage in that kind of combat willingly, you either have to be the hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned force looking to do as much damage as humanly possible, or if the forces are a little bit more closely matched, you have to be supremely confident in the capabilities of your ships and men. Because most of the risk mitigation that you go through when you're building a fleet and training a fleet goes completely out the window in close-range melee actions. So in, let's say, the Age of Sail, your risk mitigation to being raked is the line of battle. Your risk mitigation to being mobbed in detail by 2 or 3 enemy ships versus 1, even if you collectively have the greater numbers, because of course Age of Sail ships aren't particularly quick at responding to things, is again the line of battle. You all group together for mutual protection. If you sail into a mass melee engagement, then even if you have superior numbers, there's every possibility that in local points you might have 2 or 3 enemy ships ganging up on you. You might just have a ship that gets into an advantageous position to rake. And once you have that happen to 2 or 3 ships, your numerical superiority might disappear, and then it might snowball. And similarly, in World War I or World War II combat, at close range, armour probably isn't going to matter. And in fact, your armour may not matter to such a degree that in some circumstances, ships that in more traditional range combat you wouldn't have to worry about at all, like heavy or armoured cruisers, now may become a threat to some of your capital ships. Torpedoes can be launched at incredibly close ranges, and that will give you minimal, if no time at all, to respond if you even notice the torpedoes coming in. Plus, even really small ships like destroyers might again be something of a credible threat to you, because yeah, your secondary batteries might well shoot them up, but their own fast-firing batteries might do quite a number on your upper works and your fire control systems before those destroyers are put down. And the list goes on. And because this is such a random environment, all of those factors going out the way, you're even if you've trained your fleet for really, really accurate gunfire, in World War II at 2,000-3,000 yards, you'd have to have a crew of mouth-breathing incompetents to miss. So, say for example, if the Japanese had enough cruisers and destroyers to pull it off, you have a late 1940, early 1945 hypothetical battle between a Japanese formation and the US Navy. Now, the US Navy at this point might have a formation that's made up of Baltimore-class heavy cruisers and Gearing-class destroyers, the latest and greatest in heavy cruiser and destroyer technology. And they might be up against a ragtag grouping of Miyoko, Atago, Megami classes, etc. I know pretty much all of them were gone by this point, but we're making a hypothetical here. And there's maybe some Kageros, a Hatsuhara or two, etc. Now, if you engage in the rather more preferred style, i.e. 20,000 plus yards starting gunnery engagement between the cruisers, you can pretty much guarantee that with even numbers, the US formation is going to walk away with that victory pretty easily, thanks to fire control, radar, etc., etc. But if that suddenly becomes a close range action, so let's say the weather is absolutely appalling, so you can't launch aircraft to scout, and you're navigating your way through a relatively complex island chain, so your radar isn't necessarily helping all that much, and then out of the sea mist and the rain 3,000 yards away, you suddenly find yourself on a closing bearing with the Japanese formation. Well, now, yeah, your radar is a little bit useful, but the Japanese are probably going to hit you just as hard and just as easily at that range, because it was almost a point-and-shoot scenario at that point. And, they can dump torpedoes in the water left, right, and centre. It becomes a complete mess. So, you might have, let's say you're travelling in line abreast. You might have two Baltimore-class merrily travelling in line abreast, and then out of nowhere, a battered and on fire Japanese destroyer that's maybe come off worse from fighting a couple of gearings comes reeling through the mist, and before you know it, the crew have volleyed a quadruple salvo of long lances to one side to the other, and even if your secondaries now obliterate the destroyer, moments later you've lost two Baltimore class to a half dead 20-year-old destroyer. That's the kind of thing that can be a complete Admiral's nightmare in melee action, which I guess in some ways emphasises just how, as I mentioned at the top of this answer, how confident - insane some Admirals like Nelson have to be to willingly engage in it. Don Giovanni asks, how did pre-1800s shipbuilders know about things like the rake increasing speed? Was it trial and error? Did they have fluid dynamics models? Did they build scale models to trial in fluid tanks? Well, fluid tanks trials and full fluid dynamics calculations are really only possible in the latter part of the 19th century thanks to the innovations of William Froude and those who followed him. But before him, so early part of the 1800s and then, as you mentioned, pre-1800s, they did know that rake increased a ship's speed, but it was a combination of a degree of calculation, although without models and Froude's formulas it was a little bit more rough and ready, a degree of just common sense, and a significant degree of built-up institutional experience. Back then, shipbuilding was much, much more kind of an artisanal process, so you could have standard designs prepared, like with the Océan class or the Téméraire class in France particularly, or the Caledonias in Britain, but usually those designs would be prepared by individual shipwrights who may be employed in particular shipyards but could take their skills elsewhere. And those shipwrights would represent the culmination of generations of knowledge that had been essentially worked out by trial and error at first and then gradually drawn together into general principles. So the evolution from completely artisanal bespoke ships to a slightly more scientific method kind of gradually filters through the classic age of sail to the point that by the early 1800s it's become a lot more scientific but still reliant on significant bodies of knowledge as embodied by shipyards, which often had generations of shipwrights, either from the same extended family or from a loose affiliation group. Now, when it comes to rake, they recognised a few things about rake. I mean, one of them is just that in terms of bow shape, a raked bow, as you can see here on HMS Warrior, has the property of deflecting water that's splashing up, either from the ship pitching or from the forward motion of the ship. It deflects it off to either side. That makes the ship drier up top. It means the ship isn't then loaded down with water on its bow. You don't have to drain that water, and people are fairly easy. It's fairly easy for people to recognise that if you have a lot of heavy stuff hitting the ship or settling on the ship, that's going to slow the ship down. That it's intuitively fairly easy to understand and also very readily observable in actual ship practice. You don't have barges and things to compare for that kind of stuff. And as well as that, when you're talking about the really early on design period, they'd also be looking around at what is fast in the water, and they would note that fish tend to be relatively pointy when they're fast, things like tuna and so forth. They'd look in the skies and they'd see that birds are relatively pointy. They'd look at things like arrows that fly through the air long distances and go pretty fast and notice these are all things are also fairly pointy, and if you make them blunter, they tend not to work quite as well. So then the idea of making a ship relatively pointy to go faster would be logical. And then as time goes on, obviously you have to factor in the strength of a relatively narrow pointed bow versus the benefits it gives you. And this is where the scientific process gradually comes in to work out things like the angle of the rake, how long the bow should be before the ship reaches its full width, and so on and so forth. Nooblord asks, you mentioned that falsely striking your colours is extremely dishonourable, but what if the enemy shoots your colours down by, for example, knocking over the mast that carries them, and you want to continue fighting anyway? Well, this is actually where we get the expression nail your colours to the mast, because this exact kind of thing happened semi-regularly in certain battles, and the particular incident that we get the saying from was where pretty much all the masts went down, so flags had gone down with them, and the order was given, right, well, there's still a little stump of a mast, get one of the spare colours up, or one of the spare ensigns, and obviously you do carry spare flags generally, and it was literally nailed to the stub of that mast in order to indicate, no, we are continuing to fight, we are determined to remain in action. So that's generally what happens, and because of the understanding that this could be happening, this is why you get various additional items that come in with striking your colours, such as the white flag. More commonly at sea, you could do something such as hoist your opponent's colours, perhaps hoist them over your own. That was another way of showing that you struck your colours, or actually being visibly seen to haul your colours down, as opposed to just the mast going overboard. And bizarre as it might sound to us these days, there was a certain amount of etiquette and gentlemanly conduct that usually went with this kind of thing. So if a mast went over and took the ship's colours with it, and let's say all the other ensigns and flags and etc. that it had been flying had also gone by the board for whatever reason, which is one of the reasons why ships going into action tended to fly a lot of their flags, then if a new set of colours hadn't gone up for a while, then the attacking ship would quite often hail the opposing ship and ask them, oh, by the way, have you given up? And if the response comes back in the negative, they'd be like, oh, okay, fair enough, carry on then, but, just be aware your colours are down. And sometimes there were literal very polite exchanges, along the lines of, we've noticed you haven't had your colours flying for the last few minutes, but you're continuing to fire. Are you planning on giving up or not? No. We're continuing to fight, but we haven't been able to find a new set of colours to put up yet. Oh, very well. Carry on then. Just, please do put some colours up soon enough so we all know what the score is. Oh, yes, thanks very much for pointing that out. And then they continue trying to kill each other with cannons. You also get situations where, again, a ship had lost all of its colours for whatever reason, and perhaps because another ship is not right alongside it, they might send a boat over, as happened to Santissima Trinidad at one point during Trafalgar. Someone sends a boat over and comes up and says, hey, hello, we noticed you struck your colours, we're here to accept your surrender. And then they turn around and say, yeah, that's a bit of a misunderstanding, we don't really want to surrender to you at this point. And, in modern, more ruthless logic, you might think, oh, well, we should take this boat full of enemy sailors prisoner or blow them out of the water. But in those days, it was like, no, a genuine mistake. I fully understand. Okay, you can go back to your ship and please tell them, we are continuing to fight. We wouldn't want them to get the wrong impression and think that we were being dishonourable by shooting at them, which we are probably going to do in a few minutes, without having our colours raised. So, yeah, it's a very different world of the honour system back then. And it may be slightly less comprehensible to us these days, but that was what happened. KC Freeman asks, were night attacks on shipping common in World War I and World War II? And if so, what methods would pilots use to acquire their targets? Well, for what I should hope are fairly obvious reasons, it's rather difficult to get photographs of nighttime attacks on shipping at sea from aircraft from the World War I, World War II period. So here, have this rather spectacular photo of a daytime attack anyway. Nonetheless, night attacks on shipping in World War I, near enough non-existent, because nighttime flying was near enough non-existent. You do get very occasional night attacks, but I'm taking from the context of the question that you're looking at attacks on shipping at sea. Air raids on ships in harbour, that falls more under kind of, the land-based air raids where, you're trying to find a city, or in this case a port, and targeting the stuff that's within it. And finding the target is a little bit easier because at least you know where the target is or where it should be, and you have to navigate to that point, as opposed to, when it's at sea, you have to actively find a ship that's probably doing its level best not to be seen. That's not to say there aren't attacks on shipping at sea at night in World War I, but it will usually tend to be Zeppelins or other forms of airship. Now, by World War II, by contrast, night flying had advanced quite considerably, so not only do you get night attacks on ships in harbour, like Taranto, but you also get nighttime strikes on ships at sea from actually fairly early on. Now, when it comes to British aircraft, from very early on, there were radar-equipped British aircraft operating at sea at night, radar-equipped Swordfish, for example. And so from very early on, they would help find the target by radar. Obviously, you had to have a general search area to start with, and that would come either from intel or from spotting during the day from various ships and aircraft. And then you could go in. Sometimes it could be looking out for targets by naturally provided lighting, like moonlight. And this was perhaps more useful when you knew that ships would be in a general vicinity regardless of recon information, or perhaps with only very distant recon information. So, for example, night attacks on ships doing supply runs off of the North African coast on both sides were quite a regular feature of the Desert Campaign, because the moonlight could be quite strong, the Mediterranean made it relatively easy to spot the ships, and the aircraft could patrol sort of known routes. You've got the land bounding the ships on the one side, and the fact the ships don't want to get too far away from the coast, because that, depending on who's got more dominance of the Mediterranean at that particular point, may risk them being hit from the air or from the sea by the Allies or the Axis during the day. So they tend to be somewhat coastline hugging, so there's a narrow corridor. You patrol that, eventually you're probably going to find something. And then when you get towards the end of the war, you have surface search radar, or I guess air-to-surface search radar, which is then mounted on aircraft that can actually conduct the attacks themselves, as well as guide other aircraft in to conduct those assaults, which is less the case at the beginning of the war, where perhaps, a radar-equipped swordfish would be able to find a target, but the weight of the radar that it had to carry and the position of it meant that it itself couldn't really carry much in the way of offensive munitions and had to call in everybody else. Connor McClernan asks, how is crush depth for submarines determined? Also, what is the thermal layer? I've heard of it before, but was wondering exactly what it is. So crush depth for submarines is something of a calculation. It's never entirely precise because, well, there's a few factors. Firstly, you're assuming a standard material quality, a standard set of tensile strengths, yield strengths, Young's modulus, and all sorts of other fancy things that you have to deal with when it comes to engineering materials. Then you are also having to assume that whatever you're using to join the bits of the submarine's pressure hull together, whether that be riveting or welding, is also of a specific quality and minimum strength. And then you have to also theoretically assume that the density and temperature of the sea follows certain specific parameters, which, it might not. And assuming these relatively standard variables, you can, which I know sounds like a contradiction in terms, but you would have for each of those variables, you would have a standard fixed known quantity, which you would plug into the formula. And that will then spit out, for a steel cylinder of X shape and Y yield strength at Z pressure, which corresponds to A depth, etc., 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 the steel will fail at such and such a depth. Obviously, you are not going to take your submarine down to crush depth to find out, because although the calculations are a little bit conservative, all it takes is one slightly dodgy weld, one slightly thinner piece of steel, or one slightly substandard bit of equipment, or just a slightly denser sea, and pop, there goes your sub. Also, going down to very, very, very near crush depth tends to do horrifically deformative things to the hull, which means that submarine may never work properly again, because broadly speaking, in a submarine's normal operating parameters, i.e. between the surface and test depth, you should largely get elastic deformation, i.e. when the sub dives, the hull will be compressed, but when it surfaces, the hull should return to roughly the same dimensions it was previously. You go too close to crush depth, you get plastic deformation, which is, the hull has been crushed down somewhat. It ain't coming back, or at least it's not coming back all the way. That's not a good thing, because if your pressure hull gets deformed permanently, you aren't fixing that in almost all circumstances. And this is why you have your theoretical crush depth, but then you can get instances of subs both during both World Wars and even subsequently to after the period that the channel covers, where some very unlucky subs have been detected at imploding slightly above their theoretical crush depths, but perhaps happily for most submariners, more commonly, subs, well, not particularly for them, but subs that have imploded, unfortunately, more often than not actually tend to implode somewhat past their crush depth, which means that the sub was actually fairly well built. It just wasn't able to avoid that particular tragedy. Or in slightly more happy cases, submarines that have actually exceeded their crush depth, or at least on paper crush depth, and lived to talk about it. So, yeah, it's a guideline, but it's definitely not one you want to push. As far as the thermal layer, well, you can have more than one of them, but this is a property of seas and oceans. So normally the water deep down in the ocean is very cold. The water on the surface of the ocean, especially in somewhere like on the equator, might be quite warm. And there's not usually just a graduated thermal change. So, let's say, for example, if the water in the first 6 feet of a column of water in the ocean is 20 degrees Celsius, I mean, that's a little bit absurdly warm, but let's just say that it is, and it's 4 down on the ocean floor. If you dropped a remote thermometer down, you wouldn't just see it gradually tick down and down and down and down and down, because of course a lot of the heat that might be contained in the water is subject to the fact you have sunlight. So sunlight only penetrates, when you talk about oceanic depths, a relatively short distance before the water blocks it out. And once you are past that and you're in darkness, well, there's not really an awful lot to heat up the water unless you have, a thermal bloom, a geological thermal bloom somewhere down in the depths. But that's something of a side issue. And then you also have the fact that there are currents in the ocean, and they're not just necessarily currents in the way we think about them, as in, a whole body of water moving one way. You can have currents on the surface, and you can have currents deeper down going in a completely different direction. And the water that's moving through that lower current might be from a different part of the ocean or a different depth of the ocean, and therefore might be at a completely different temperature, apart from the standard separation between warm water that's been heated by the sun and the cold depths that never get any sunlight. And then you also have water that might be separated slightly by density, changing levels of salinity, again, usually from bodies of water that are coming in from different parts of the world. And the long and the short of it is that all of these variables will lead to points in the ocean depth, and they're not consistent. You can have, as I said, multiple layers. You can have a very shallow layer, you can have a deep layer, etc., etc. But at some point in most areas of the ocean that are deep enough, you'll end up with a plane at which, or depth at which, the temperature above that will very rapidly change to a higher temperature, and the temperature below that will drop quite very rapidly to a lower temperature. Occasionally it might be the other way around, because it's the sea and nothing is entirely predictable. But in any case, this creates a relatively definitive thermal barrier. And because the properties of water do vary slightly depending on temperature, particularly when it comes to how it reflects sound, then this can be exploited by submarines and submarine hunters in terms of reflecting sonar to hide from it, reflecting sonar to propagate the sonar further than you might otherwise think, or dropping a towed array below the layer to hear a submarine that's down there, whilst the layer also protects your surface ship from being possibly detected by the submarine that's beneath the layer, and the list goes on. If it helps at all, imagine the glass prism or glass block experiment that you tend to do in high school physics lectures, where you direct an angled beam of light across paper through the air and then into a glass block, and you see the deflection of that light as it goes into and then hopefully exits the glass as well. And sound moving through different densities, different salinity levels, and different thermal capacities of water, not thermal capacities, different thermal temperatures of water, exhibits similar issues with deflection, diffusion, and reflection. And that's basically the thermal layer in short. Sapper Ninja asks, I'm fascinated by the armament of the King George V. It's just such an oddball compared to contemporary ships. My question is, what is your opinion on the armament overall? Was the 10-9 or 10-8 ratio of hits worth the lessened kill power per hit of the 14-inch gun? Or would the 12-gun variant have been substantially better? Also, as the treaty system collapses during the design phase, how late in the design or construction could the Royal Navy have switched back to 12 guns? How late could they have decided on a more radical change, like using the slightly narrower Barbetta than Nelson's to get a 9-16-inch armament? And would the ships have been better off? Behold my masterfully photoshopped 12-gun KGV. Nonetheless, Was the 10 to 9 or 10 to 8 ratio of hits worth the less in kill power of the 14-inch gun? Well, at the time it was being designed, they didn't really have much choice. Well, they technically did have a choice, let's be fair, because they had the 9 15-inch option. But when they were designing the King George V, they were doing so under the auspices of the government pressing for the 14-inch armament in the Second London Naval Treaty, and they felt that if they said, okay, well, we want this in this upcoming treaty to drop the main armament from 16 down to 14 inches, but we're going to lay down a ship armed with 15 or 16-inch guns right before the treaty gets signed, that might look like bad faith, so we're going to, design the ship for these 14-inch guns. The same as that, actually, well, even though the Americans weren't really pushing for the 14-inch gun, as a show of good faith, they also were designing the North Carolinas with a 14-inch armament. So it's not so much a case of, we want more guns but lesser caliber as a specific deliberate choice. It's more a case of this is what the treaty and the politics are forcing us to go with. If, therefore, we are going to have to design a ship with 14-inch guns instead of 15 or 16-inch guns as already existed, then we need more guns. We need to hit more often because of the individually slightly reduced killing power of the 14-inch shell. Hence why the original design called for 12. The cut down to 10, where the superfiring forward turret, B turret, was cut down to a twin, was to try and keep the ship within the 35,000-ton limit with the armour and speed regimen that they wanted, and of course the 35,000-ton limit was something that had been around for a lot longer. As for, would the 12-gun variant have been substantially better? Well, it would have had 2 more guns, so that's a good thing. It may have accomplished slightly more. I mean, every time Prince of Wales sends a salvo out at Denmark Strait, or Duke of York sends a salvo out at North Cape, or King George V sends a salvo out at the last action of Bismarck, which incidentally, weirdly enough, doesn't have a battle of name. Suggestions in the comments below. Then, that's 2 extra chances per salvo, assuming that the gun turret's working, for those shells to score hits and do more damage. As for how late in the design could they have switched back to 12 guns, not too far down the design process, to be fair, because the calculation of weights, the calculation of balance, trim where the centre of gravity is, etc., all of that will have been made with the knowledge that we're using a twin turret in B position. If you are going to go, actually no, we're going to go back to using a quad, well, the barbette obviously has to be substantially larger. That may involve alterations to the overall size and shape of the hull, because with a twin, obviously there's saved space involved. Reallocating all the compartments, obviously a quad and its barbette is going to weigh more, so the balance is going to have to be different. And yes, whilst the quad design had been drafted in a very basic form, that was obviously overweight, so they could go back to that and say, okay, we're actually going to develop this down, but essentially you'd be taking the design back to a draft form, which would mean any work that you'd done past that point would be null and void. And really, once the decision has been made to turn B into a twin turret, and all the calculations have been made on that, you basically can't really change the armament for anything else, because you have these varying barbette diameter widths. So whilst in theory it would be a relatively easy job to drop in 16s instead of quad 14s in terms of, can we build a 16 turret that will fit the barbette diameter of a quad 14, which, to be fair, is basically what they did with the first draft of the Lions, that twin is gonna be a big problem. If they'd gone with the 12-gun version, as you can see here, it would be a lot easier. But yeah, the twin barbette, there's nothing really that you can change that for unless you're downgrading the armament. And trust me, if you're going to downgrade it, I don't know, and put a triple 12 in place of the twin 14, no one wants to know what a quintuple 12-inch turret would look like. Michael Imbezi asks, you've sometimes referred to the Fletcher class and Clemson class as the Fletcher Swarm and Clemson Swarm, respectively. In your opinion, roughly how many ships should a class have to be considered a swarm? Now, obviously, this is a completely subjective opinion, so everyone's ideas may vary, and I think the important thing to qualify is, in my mind, what constitutes a swarm is going to vary quite a lot depending on what class of ship you're looking at. So, I've mentioned the Essex Swarm. Now, whilst a lot of Essex-class carriers were built, there still weren't quite as many as Clemsons or Fletchers, and some other classes of varying ships were built in considerably greater numbers than the Essexes, but I wouldn't necessarily call them a swarm because they're smaller vessels. So there is going to be a certain degree of variance as ships get larger, but if we use destroyers as a base, and then hopefully you can understand the logic across the field, for destroyers, they typically are ordered in flotillas or half flotillas around the main time of the period the channel covers. So you'll be talking 6, 12 or something in that region, usually around 12 plus or minus a few. So that's a flotilla. So if someone orders a couple of flotillas, okay, fine. If someone orders a handful of flotillas, okay, now you're edging a bit more towards being a swarm. So I think if, as a rough rule of thumb, if somebody ordered 4 flotillas or above, so you're talking about roughly 50 ships, give or take, 4 flotillas would be 48, and then maybe you include flotilla leaders in that, but yeah, anyway. So if you build about 50 or more destroyers, either to exactly the same hull plan or close enough, like the Wicks and Clemsons, then anything above that I think you can, in my mind, constitute a swarm. And that's why with the Essexes, because you look at most carrier production runs in the time period, a lot of them are building in pairs. You've got the Yorktowns, which are technically 3 if you include Hornet, although she is a bit of a late addition. The single biggest class of fleet carrier, other than the Essexes, built at that time period is, if you're talking full fleet carriers, is going to be the Illustriouses, and even then you have to start arguing about whether Indomitable is an Illustrious or a halfway house. And then you compare to the fact you've got double-digit numbers of fleet carriers coming out with the Essexes. So if you took, let's say, a generous average of 3, and then you applied the same logic that we did with the destroyers, which is if you 4 flotillas or above, so 3 multiplied by 4, so that's 12. Well, there's certainly a lot more than 12 Essexes built, therefore the Essexes would constitute a swarm. This is why I don't think there's really any pre-dreadnought swarms, because pre-dreadnoughts tend to be ordered, well, if they're not one-offs, there's a lot of classes of pre-dreadnoughts that get ordered either in pairs or 4s, and, well, 4x4 would be 16. No one ordered 16 dreadnoughts or pre-dreadnoughts to exactly the same design. The closest you get is the King Edward the 7th, and they don't come close to those sort of numbers. Brian Rederman asks, what caused the transition to fully enclosed turrets on smaller ships like destroyers? Whilst to an extent making the crew's lives better by improving the weatherproofing was a concern, the single biggest factors are complexity and size, which is related to weight, which also kind of leads back to a certain degree to complexity. So when you're looking at World War I era destroyers, and indeed a fair number of the smaller cruisers, you tend to see either open gun mounts or just shielded gun mounts with an open back. And there are various other reasons to have open back mounts, as I've mentioned before, with shrapnel concerns and so forth. But essentially, when you have a single gun mount, even a 6-inch, you can manually train those guns, and of course manually load them, etc., without too much in the way of other assistance. I mean, you'll have some mechanical assistance from geared systems and such like, but they can essentially be standalone units. And once you're looking at basically a mechanically operated weapon, you can, through the use of using rust-proof alloys and so forth, bronze or stainless steel or just lots of paint, they can pretty much shrug off weather conditions. And if you just give it a light shield, you don't increase the weight too much, so you can keep up with that. As time goes on through the 1920s and 1930s and then into World War II, however, you have a few issues crop up. Firstly, you have RPC, power operating for the guns, and that somewhat comes in with single mounts, but a lot of it comes in when you have dual mounts, because once you have dual or triple mounts, then all of a sudden that weight gets a little bit too much for reliable, purely manual or mechanically assisted manual use. So if you're now involving motors or hydraulics, etc., those are a bit more sensitive to weather than the average person, so they need to be protected. The systems also get more complex and more powerful because a lot of these systems, when you talk about destroyers and some cruiser guns, are now becoming dual purpose, so their elevation needs to be higher. So you're now talking about gun pits as well, which could fill with water. And you've then got various other systems as well, the gyro stabilizing in the case of cruiser guns, although that's a little bit later to be introduced into destroyer weapons, and then electronic relays both to and from central fire control systems, radar, etc., etc. And all of this technology is water sensitive, whether it's the training systems to allow you to actually move a triple turret or a twin mount that you physically can't really move reliably anymore, or whether it's all the electronics that allow you to put those shells down on range, at which point those things need to be enclosed, and thus comes the fully enclosed turret or fully enclosed mount. Of course, that in and of itself introduces more weight, and thus the whole thing becomes somewhat self-justifying, especially when, once you have a fully enclosed mount, especially for cruisers, you start thinking about putting armour on it to protect your big box of valuable guns and people and electronics. Redacted asks, you're given a budget equivalent to half the cost of building a midway to modernise USS Saratoga in 1946. How would you go about doing this, and how long would the hypothetical Saratoga last, and what sort of service do you think she would see? I mean, in pure monetary terms, you're then talking almost exactly as much as she cost to build, although obviously thanks to inflation that's actually worth less money by 1946. But modernising Saratoga is going to be quite difficult. On the one hand, thanks to her drive system, her turbines won't have had quite the same level of strain and stress put on them as they would have been if she had been a conventional vessel, but conventionally powered, that is. But at the same time, she is still going to be not quite, but almost on her last legs machinery-wise. So you'd have to replace and modernise all the machinery for one thing. She's taken a heck of a lot of damage during World War II. She's almost like Enterprise, more of a floating collection of patchwork repairs than anything else. So that might have some implications on her long-term hull integrity and so forth. Size-wise, the longer Essexes are approaching her size. And of course you've got Midway coming out. But there is a few little advantages to her if you wanted to modernise her for post-World War II service. The main one being that her hangar deck is still very tall, so she won't suffer the same issues as the Essexes from that perspective, at least initially. Strength of flight deck and length of flight deck will still be problems, but if I was going to try and modernise her in 46, well, it's a little bit too early to do an angled flight deck, but as I said, machinery, yes. Remove or at least significantly thin down the belt armour. That'll save weight. And, well, at that point, most of the rest of the modernisation is going to be going into a new modern anti-aircraft defence suite. I mean, she's been refitted in World War II, but post-World War II anti-aircraft defence is a very different beast. Probably widening the hangar, the flight deck as much as possible. That's not going to be a lot, but it would help. Maybe if she's kept in long enough in refit, she might also be able to get some steam catapults installed. That'd be quite nice. but that's probably about as much as you could really do, other than a general machinery and electronics overhaul, with the money that's available. So you'd end up with something that probably has about as much utility in the immediate early Cold War environment as one of the longer hull Essexes, with a few disadvantages in some areas, but a few advantages in others, particularly in terms of the height of aircraft that she can operate. So I think she probably would have lasted maybe a decade or two after emerging from refit in terms of what she's capable of. In reality, probably less than that, because she'd be a one-ship class, whereas everybody else at least can rely on each other for spares and interoperability. And finally, Daniel asks, had the 1933 Operations IV Wargame ended differently and the US had not revised War Plan Orange, is it conceivable to think that the United States would not win in the Pacific, or that combat would be elongated by several more violent years? So this is essentially, what if the US had just gone with the original flavour plans back from the early part of the interwar period, which was form the fleet together, steam them over to the Philippines, take on the Japanese in their home waters, i.e. what the Japanese Kantai-Kessen doctrine was specifically designed to counter. Well, it depends how World War II breaks out, because, not to put too fine a point on it, but with Pearl Harbor happening, that kind of puts the kibosh on that idea anyway, because in order to form a battle fleet, which, bear in mind that the Americans at this point don't know about the Yamatos, but even then, putting together a battle fleet in late 41 that the Americans would think, yes, we can go and take on the Japanese battle line, because of course you assume worst case scenario, so you assume there's 10 Japanese ships, that's gonna be a bit of a problem. Because even if you get Colorado out of dock, you don't have most of your big five standards available. I mean, okay, Maryland would probably be made available relatively quickly, but you are essentially going to be sailing with mostly your older stuff. So Arkansas, Texas, New York, the New Mexicos, and whatever of the big five you managed to scrape together. At which point, numerically, your battle line is approximately the same as the Japanese. The War Plan Orange does not allow for that, the original one. War Plan Orange assumes a superiority of force. And similarly, I mean, okay, aircraft carrier-wise, you haven't lost any aircraft carriers by December 8th, 1941, but even if you put together, again, assuming that everything can be made operational, and you get the Yorktowns and the Lexingtons and Saratoga and Wasp, etc., you're still only roughly matching the Japanese in fleet carrier terms, and the Japanese have a few more smaller stuff like Rougeau floating around to hit you with. So even if the Americans ignore everything else and they're still stuck with this war plan, after December 7th, they don't have the resources to do the original War Plan Orange immediately. It's not going to stop the US winning the war in the Pacific, because eventually they can build up. And I mean, even if, alien mind control or something, they do send the entirety of the US Navy battle line, such as it is, on December 8th, 1941 or January 1942, even if that all gets sent across the Pacific. Okay, it's the Japanese dream come true. The Japanese will probably, put Kantai-Kessen into effect. They'll probably win that. But it's still going to cost the Japanese some ships that they can't really easily replace. And the US, whilst not easy, can replace them. The Japanese have Yamato and Musashi coming in. The Americans have the North Carolinas, the South Dakotas, and the Iowas all on production. And if they've lost everything else, at least Kentucky and Illinois are still going to be made, if not even possibly the Montanas. The Essexes are all on the slipways. Hornet probably is going to miss it, but Hornet will come online. Eventually, the US fleet will make its advance. So it's not going to win the war for the Japanese, unless the US decides to just bow out for whatever reason. Will the combat be elongated? Somewhat, but there's always the big elephant in the room that is the atomic bomb. Once that comes into play, it's going to be game over for Japan pretty quickly. As I mentioned in a few other of these hypotheticals, the main question is, by summer 1945, when the atomic bomb is ready, where is the US advance? Because if the US advance has the range to reach Japan, then, basically rocks fall, everybody dies, game over. Whereas if the US advance, which conceivably if they'd thrown their fleet away at the beginning of 1942 might be the case, has not quite reached B-29 range of Japan yet, well then Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Saipan, etc. are probably going to be cleared with the use of nuclear fire, which is probably not going to do great things for the long-term cancer rates of the US troops that are then sent to occupy the irradiated wastelands. But inevitably, at some point in 46, the US will reach a point where they can get troops and B-29s close enough to Japan to hit Japan, and then they hit Japan with atomic bombs, and then rocks fall, everyone dies, game over. Well done. That's kind of the hard point. If you want to extend the Pacific War past 1946 in any conceivable, vaguely realistic scenario, you have to somehow delete the atomic bomb from the equation. And that's it for this video. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. It's the Drydock is over. You may now resume your regularly scheduled human activities, and we shall see you again in another video. Bye.